Gold Rush is maybe the classic American story. One of the funny things about the gold rush is that very few people actually made any money from gold itself.
In the wake of the California gold rush, the Chinese immigrant population in the United States skyrocketed from just 55 to over 150,000. These pioneers left an indelible mark across the American frontier, not only transforming the Golden State, but also reaching into the wild terrains of Canada and Mexico. Facing harsh laws and rugged landscapes, they forged lives marked by incredible resilience and quiet acts of rebellion. Join us as we peel back the layers of history to explore the hidden lives and daily struggles of the Chinese on the American frontier. But first, let's uncover how the gold rush began. Road to California's gold rush. Gold was first discovered on March 9, 1842, by a Californian named Francisco Lopez, long before the famous rush of the 49ers. While the momentous event is often overshadowed by later discoveries, it deserves its spotlight. Lopez wasn't on a treasure hunt. He was simply looking for stray horses. During his search near present-day Newhall, and about 35 miles northwest of Los Angeles, he stopped along a creek in Placerita Canyon. There, while the horses grazed, Lopez dug up some wild onions, and to his surprise, he found a small gold nugget among the bulbs. Intrigued, he searched more and unearthed additional gold. Lopez promptly took his findings to the local authorities, who confirmed the value of the gold. Inspired, he and others continued to explore the northeastern parts of the forest within what is now Ventura County, finding more gold stream beds. Despite these early finds and even some gold sent to the U.S. Mint in November of the same year, these discoveries attracted little notice and did not spark the famed rush. Meanwhile, other minor finds occurred, with gold discovered by Mission Indians who were instructed by the friars to keep the locations a secret. The aim was to avoid exactly what would eventually unfold, a gold rush. Fast forward to January 1848. The setting shifts to Sutter's Mill in Coloma, near the American River. This is where the well-known part of our story unfolds. James W. Marshall, while constructing a lumber mill for John Sutter, spotted shiny metal in the tail race of the mill. The discovery came just after the end of the Mexican-American War, an event that ceded California to the United States, setting the stage for what was to come. Marshall and Sutter tested the metal and confirmed it was indeed gold. Despite Sutter's initial dismay and his desire to keep the find a secret, fearing it would disrupt his agricultural plans, the secret didn't hold. In February 1848, John Sutter, deeply concerned about his agricultural empire, sent Charles Bennett to Monterey to secure the mineral rights of the land. Bennett had strict instructions not to reveal the gold discovery. However, his first stop was Benicia, where overhearing discussions about coal near Mount Diablo loosened his tongue, and he blurted out about the gold. Bennett's inability to keep the secret persisted. Upon reaching San Francisco, he once again spilled the beans about the gold discovery. When he finally met with Colonel Mason in Monterey, the chief U.S. official in California declined to make any judgment on the land and mineral rights. For the third time, Bennett couldn't hold back and revealed the gold discovery. By March 1848, rumors of the discovery were buzzing, and they were soon confirmed by San Francisco newspaper publisher and merchant Samuel Brannan. Not one to miss an opportunity, Brannan set up a store to sell gold prospecting supplies. He walked through the streets of San Francisco, waving a vial of gold, shouting, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." His shouts weren't just words. They were the sirens that called thousands to California. On August 19, 1848, the New York Herald became the first major newspaper on the East Coast to report the gold discovery. Later, on December 5th, President James K. Polk officially confirmed the discovery of gold in his address to Congress. This public confirmation by the president was all it took to turn the rush into an avalanche. People from across the United States and from other countries, later known as 49ers, began pouring into the mother lode, the gold country of California. As Sutter had feared, his agricultural business was devastated. His workers, bitten by gold fever, abandoned him in droves, chasing after their fortunes. Meanwhile, squatters took over his land, helping themselves to his crops and cattle. San Francisco, a tiny settlement before the gold rush, underwent a radical transformation. Initially, the city turned into a ghost town with abandoned ships and businesses. However, it soon boomed as merchants, adventurers, and fortune seekers flooded in. From about 1,000 residents in 1848, the population exploded to 25,000 by 1850. The cityscape changed dramatically, with miners setting up tents, wooden shanties, and using deck cabins taken from the many abandoned ships. Dreams of gold and trials of Chinese miners. News of the California gold rush made its way to China around 1848, sparking a surge of excitement and hope among the Chinese people. Two stories tell how the news spread. One involves a merchant named Chum Ming, who struck gold in the Sierra Nevada foothills and wrote to a friend back home. The other story tells of a ship that docked in Hong Kong carrying California gold dust, and a Honolulu newspaper with tales of vast gold finds. Despite the laws against leaving China at the time, the dream of Gold Mountain, as they called America, was too tempting. Men began booking their passage to California, paying their own way for the most part. These journeys were not for the faint of heart. The 10 to 12-week voyages were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and fraught with high mortality rates. The only food available was dried fish and rice, and those who didn't survive the harsh conditions were simply tossed overboard. Amid these perilous journeys, a missionary named William Spear worked in San Francisco, treating the sick passengers arriving by the boatloads. He expressed deep concern and outrage over the conditions they endured, declaring that there was no excuse before God or man for the terrible mortality rates observed on these voyages. By 1849, approximately 325 Chinese immigrants had passed through San Francisco. However, by 1852, the number skyrocketed to over 20,000, making up 10% of California's population at that time. This massive influx wasn't solely driven by the lure of gold. Back home, the political and social landscape was dire. The Qing dynasty was crumbling, a decline that would culminate in its fall by 1911. The Taiping Rebellion, raging from 1850 to 1864, claimed over 10 million lives. Add to this the turmoil of the two Opium Wars between China and Great Britain from 1839 to 1860, combined with frequent floods and famines, and it's clear why many were desperate to escape and try their luck on distant shores. The journey to Gold Mountain was perilous, but the promise of a new life in the United States was a risk many were willing to take. While hope propelled thousands towards California's promising shores, the reality of their arrival was starkly different and increasingly hostile. As the gold rush hit its stride, the number of Chinese immigrants arriving in California soared. By the spring of 1852, resentment among white miners grew palpable. This tension culminated in a miners' meeting in Colombia, in the Sierra Nevada area, where resolutions were passed denouncing the influx of what they labeled as degraded Asiatics and outright banning Chinese from local mining claims. The hostility didn't end at mere words. Along the American River, a violent episode unfolded as a few dozen white miners forcibly expelled 200 Chinese miners from their dig sites. Motivated by their success, these miners, accompanied by a band playing music triumphantly, then moved to another camp where they drove out 400 more Chinese miners. This era marked a dark chapter in American history, as violence and discrimination against the Chinese only worsened over time. By 1877, the United States was grappling with the so-called Long Depression, which had unemployment rates soaring over 20% in places like San Francisco. It was on July 24th of that year that a group of disgruntled laborers and miners ignited the notorious race riots, The chaos began with the setting fire to the Beale Street Wharf, causing over $500,000 in damages, a deliberate diversion to draw police away from the main violence brewing near Chinatown. As the police were distracted, mobs descended upon Chinatown, burning Chinese-owned businesses and causing about $100,000 worth of damage. This violent spree resulted in the tragic deaths of 4 Chinese immigrants. In the economic aftermath, discrimination intensified. Levi's, which had employed 186 Chinese laborers the previous year, fired all of them in favor of hiring only citizen workers. This period also saw heightened rivalry with Irish immigrants who had themselves been flooding into the country during the Great Famine of the 1840s. Although facing discrimination themselves, many Irish were heavily involved in the anti-Chinese movement, displeased at being grouped with another marginalized community. The tension was institutionalized in 1850 when the foreign miners' tax was enacted, imposing a $20 monthly tax on all foreign miners, explicitly targeting both Chinese and Irish miners. Signs that read, "Irish need not apply," were also common, further deepening the divide. This period of tension and violence reached a legislative climax in 1882 when President Chester A. Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This law prohibited Chinese laborers from immigrating to the U.S. for 10 years and denied them the possibility of gaining citizenship. The law, devastating in its exclusivity, also made exceptions for certain professionals and diplomats, but essentially barred a significant portion of Chinese from entering the country. These discriminatory laws remained in effect for the next 60 years, casting a long shadow over the lives of Chinese immigrants and their descendants in America. Invisible heroes of the rails. Between 1863 and 1869, a monumental task was underway: the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. This project, which transformed America, would not have been possible without the sweat and toil of 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese workers. They were the backbone of the western part of the railway, especially through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. These workers faced incredibly harsh conditions. They were paid half the wages of their white counterparts and didn't enjoy the luxury of sleeping in train cars. Instead, they were confined to tents. Each day was grueling. Imagine shoveling 20 pounds of rock 400 times under the relentless sun or bitter cold. The dangers were constant: avalanches, dynamite mishaps, and treacherous terrain. The true death toll remains unknown, but estimates suggest as many as 1,200 might have perished. Many of those who died were buried in unmarked graves along the tracks, their contributions and sacrifices nearly forgotten. In 1864, as workers struggled through the Sierra Nevadas, the dream of a coast-to-coast connection was faltering. The majority of the Caucasian labor force was distracted by the gold rush, prompting railroad magnate Charles Crocker to call in reinforcements. In February of 1865, 50 Chinese workers were brought to a construction site on a flat car. The next day, they worked a staggering 12-hour shift, impressing Crocker so much that the number of Chinese laborers soon escalated to 3,000, and within a few months, doubled to 6,000. These laborers undertook the most perilous tasks with remarkable courage. They dangled from cliffs on ropes, blasted through rock using highly volatile nitroglycerin, an explosive so dangerous that no one else dared handle it. Their resilience was extraordinary, but so was their approach to staying healthy and energized. Unlike their white co-workers who consumed stale meat and whiskey, these Chinese workers nourished themselves with oysters and cuttlefish shipped from San Francisco, supplemented by rice, vegetables from gardens they cultivated along the railway, and plenty of tea. By 1869, Chinese workers constituted 90% of the railway's labor force. On April 27th of that year, they set a record by laying 10 miles of track in just one day. Yet despite these monumental achievements, their names and stories were erased from history. At the grand ceremony in Promontory, Utah, where the final spike was driven to connect the two lines, These workers were absent from photographs, and their pivotal role went unrecognized by the cameras capturing the celebration of the railroad tycoons. We do know about one remarkable individual who survived the hazardous railway construction and went on to revolutionize the citrus industry, making it possible for Americans to enjoy oranges throughout the year. Meet Liu Gim-gong, a name not widely recognized, but one that has left a juicy legacy in the world of agriculture. Born around 1860 in Guangdong Province, China, Liu immigrated to the U.S. at the tender age of 12. Initially, he found work in a Massachusetts shoe factory, enduring the long hours and harsh conditions typical for immigrants at the time. But Liu was destined for something greater. Seeking a better life, he moved to the frontier and joined the army of Chinese laborers constructing the Transcontinental Railroad. Despite the perilous work and dangerous conditions, Liu survived. After his stint on the railroad, he made a life-altering move to Florida in the 1880s, where his true passion would blossom. In Florida, Liu entered the world of agriculture, working under the mentorship of a wealthy horticulturist named Fanny Burlingame. It was here that Liu's interest in plant breeding, particularly citrus fruits, took root. Citrus was becoming big business in Florida, and Liu was about to revolutionize it. Dubbed the Citrus Wizard, Liu Gim-gong developed a frost-resistant orange that could thrive in Central Florida's cooler climates. This innovation extended the growing season, greatly impacting the state's citrus industry. The variety he created, known as the Liu Gim-gong orange, is a hybrid between a Mediterranean sweet orange and a tangerine. But Liu didn't stop there. He also successfully developed a seedless grapefruit among other fruit varieties. Chinese on Canadian rails. In the 1880s, 6,500 Chinese immigrants headed north, not to find gold, but to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, which was to connect Calgary to Vancouver. This venture was no less dangerous than their counterparts' experiences in the United States. Tragically, it's estimated that one worker died for every mile of track laid through the rugged mountains. These workers faced severe inequality in wages and working conditions. While they earned just $1 a day, their Caucasian counterparts made double that amount and didn't have to pay for their food and drink. Those costs were included in their wages. The Chinese laborers, however, had to stretch their meager earnings to cover the basics for survival. The story takes a more disheartening turn at the end of the railway construction. At the last spike ceremony in Craigellachie, British Columbia, just like what happened at Promontory Point in Utah, the Chinese workers were deliberately removed from the scene so photographers could capture an image without them, erasing their monumental efforts from the celebratory visuals. Following the railway completion, Canadian attitudes and policies toward Chinese immigrants hardened significantly. In 1900, Canada doubled the entry fee for Chinese immigrants from $50 to $100. 3 years later, in 1903, a head tax was introduced, requiring Chinese immigrants to pay an additional $500 to enter the country. These steep financial barriers were effective. The number of Chinese immigrants entering Canada dropped dramatically from 5,000 in 1904 to just 8 in 1905. The tension culminated in 1907 during a massive anti-Chinese rally outside Vancouver City Hall, attended by 30,000 people, half the city's population at the time. The protesters wore ribbons advocating for a non-Asian Canada. In the following days, Vancouver's Chinatown was violently ransacked, with Chinese homes and businesses destroyed. The discriminatory policies peaked in 1923 when Canada enacted its own version of the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning all Chinese immigration for the next 25 years. Chinatown's Tong Wars. The Tong Wars, much like many historical conflicts, often sprang from intensely personal issues. In this case, a dire shortage of women. By the late 1800s, the ratio of male to female Chinese immigrants was heavily skewed due to the Page Law of 1875. Officially aimed at curbing the immigration of Chinese laborers, this law disproportionately prevented Chinese women from entering the U.S., purportedly to stop them from engaging in immoral purposes. This inadvertently intensified competition and tensions among men in Chinatown communities. San Francisco was a hotspot for these rivalries, home to several powerful tongs such as the Hop Sing Tong, Sui Sing Tong, Hip Sing Tong, Bing Kong Tong, and On Leong Tong, among others. The tangled affiliations meant individuals could belong to multiple tongs, complicating conflicts further. A typical scenario might unfold over a personal slight, say, a stolen sweetheart, which could escalate into a multi-tong war, dragging multiple groups into chaos. Drama filled the streets and even theaters. In one incident in New York City, a feud over a theater seat escalated into a full-blown confrontation. The city saw its own share of Tong leadership clashes, notably between Mock Duck, leader of the Hip Sing Tong, known for his fiery temper and flamboyant style, and Tom Lee, head of the On Leong Tong. Tom Lee, unlike Mock Duck, operated with a strategic finesse, earning the nickname the unofficial mayor of Chinatown due to his extensive connections with politicians and law enforcement, which allowed his tong to operate almost with impunity. The warfare between the Hip Sing and the On Leong Tongs was intense, marked by assassination attempts and street battles. These often involved hatchet men or high binders, hired assassins famed for their brutal use of hatchets. The violence wasn't just limited to personal vendettas. It spilled over into the streets, affecting the broader community and eventually drawing the attention of authorities who worked to suppress it by the end of the 1800s. One of the most notorious figures in the history of San Francisco's Chinatown was Little Pete, a gangster who by the 1880s and 90s had amassed enormous wealth and influence. His rivalry with another gang leader, Big Jim, was legendary. This feud culminated in Little Pete's assassination at the age of 33 in 1897. His funeral was an extravagant affair, reflective of his status in the community. A horse-drawn hearse carried his casket through the streets of Chinatown, accompanied by a procession of carriages and colorful silk banners that celebrated his life and contributions. The ceremony was steeped in Chinese spiritual customs, with offerings of food, candles, and incense, all meant to secure good fortune for Pete in the afterlife. Despite Little Pete's dramatic send-off, the Tong Wars did not end with his death. The power vacuum he left led to continued strife as others vied to claim his criminal empire. The ongoing battles reflected the fierce, often brutal struggle for control and respect within the Chinatown underworld. Yet none could match the mix of reverence, fear, and awe that Little Pete commanded, solidifying his legacy as a legendary figure in the turbulent history of the American frontier. Hidden tragedy in Chinatown. Under the guise of legitimate operations, some gangsters, like the infamous Little Pete, exploited the Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted Chinese immigration unless they were merchants or entertainers. Little Pete cunningly used fake documents to bring hundreds of women into the country, claiming they were actors or acrobats for San Francisco's Midwinter Fair of 1884. However, the grim reality was that these women were not brought to perform at the fair, but were destined for far more nefarious activities. These women, often referred to with the euphemism "daughters of joy," were forced into lives of servitude as concubines. The term, though sounding pleasant, masked the cruel reality of their existence. This practice was rampant throughout the Chinatowns across the frontier, especially in San Francisco. When 24 Chinese women entered the port of San Francisco, documents declared them merchant wives and daughters. Yet the New York Times revealed the truth, scoffing at these claims and exposing a growing business in the Chinese slave trade. Girls were bought from their parents for $100 to $300 with promises of marriage upon their arrival in the U.S. Instead, They were sold for $1,500 to $2,000 and placed in disreputable houses. These concubine girls, who did not speak English, were told horror stories about the abusive conditions they would face if they sought help from Christian rescue missions. Unfortunately, these missions could offer little real protection. Those who dared to escape faced the risk of being recaptured by Chinese gangs or anti-Chinese mobs and forced back into concubinage. Attending church or seeking help was fraught with danger. Ringleaders of these concubine operations would employ corrupt lawyers and police officers to thwart any escape attempts, ensuring the women were sent back to the brothels. Some women had contracts taken out against them merely for attempting to seek help. Even rescue efforts by powerful Chinese civic groups were undermined by the deeply entrenched and financially lubricated brothel network, which had the means to pay off bribes and maintain their grim business. Mexican ordeal. In the scorching summer of 1902, 42 Chinese migrant workers embarked on a perilous journey. They set sail from Sinaloa, Mexico, aiming for a small fishing village in Baja California, enticed by the promise of agricultural jobs in the nearby Mexicali area, just across the California border. With no money for transport, these migrants planned to trek 100 miles across harsh desert terrain on foot. To guide them, they hired a local unemployed fisherman who, unfortunately, was unfamiliar with the desert's brutal conditions. As they marched under the unforgiving sun, dreaming of a better future, the reality of their situation quickly set in. The intense heat proved overwhelming, and by the journey's end, only 8 of the original 42 made it through alive. The area where so many perished tragically came to be known locally as El Desierto de los Chinos, or the Desert of the Chinese. The struggles of Chinese immigrants weren't confined to the American frontier. They faced severe challenges in Mexico as well. From the 1880s into the 1920s, Chinese immigrants were the fastest-growing group in Mexico, their numbers swelling from fewer than 2,000 in 1895 to 20,000 by 1920. Many Chinese men married local women and converted to Catholicism, adopting Christian names in hopes of better assimilating into Mexican society. However, the rising number of Chinese immigrants led to growing resentment and fear of economic competition, sparking an anti-Chinese movement that intensified during the Mexican Revolution and worsened during the Great Depression. One of the darkest episodes occurred in 1911, when a faction of Pancho Villa's army brutally killed over 300 Chinese individuals in Torreon, halving the town's Chinese population. This violence was part of a broader pattern of persecution that peaked in the 1930s with mass deportations, expelling nearly 70% of the Chinese-Mexican population from Mexico. Interactions with Native Americans. As Chinese immigrants made their way to the American frontier, they began to cross paths with Native Americans. These encounters were a blend of curiosity, cooperation, and conflict. Both groups initially viewed each other with fascination, each wondering about possible common ancestral ties. This curiosity wasn't unfounded. There's scientific evidence suggesting a genetic link between East Asians and Native Americans, hinting at ancient migrations from Asia to the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge or coastal hopping. Economically, the Chinese and Native Americans found both synergy and rivalry. They worked side by side in fishing and canneries, harnessing the bounties of nature. However, competition arose in areas like laundry services and hop picking, industries where jobs were scarce and demand was high. This competition sometimes escalated into violence, highlighting the tension that economic desperation can breed. The complexity of their interactions didn't stop at the job market. There was a darker side involving illegal activities, such as the prohibited sale of alcohol to Native Americans. Chinese middlemen who engaged in this trade risked imprisonment or hefty fines if caught. Furthermore, interactions could turn deceitful and dangerous. Native Americans sometimes imposed minor taxes on Chinese miners or even resorted to kidnapping or robbery. In a twist of irony, The Chinese miners sometimes retaliated by paying these taxes with fake gold, adding layers of deception to their already strained relations. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.